Forgotten Voices of the Great War, 1914, from the Toll House in Lancaster. Imperial War Museum. In 1972, the Imperial War Museum set about the momentous task of tracing ordinary veterans and survivors of the First World War and interviewing them in detail about their experiences. The Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, which includes the first-hand experiences of British, French, German, American, Canadian and Anzac soldiers, has since grown to be the most important of its kind in the world and provides a vivid and compelling account of the day-to-day life during one of the most harrowing periods of modern history. These tapes, many of which have rested unheard for decades, contain the forgotten voices of a generation no longer with us. Introduction. A remarkable collection of taped interviews held by the Imperial War Museum were recorded over 40 years, from about 1960, and these have been turned into a book from which I have constructed this talk. The photograph shows troops going over the top, an action which must have been terrifying for every soldier. I have sought to capture the words of men and women to find out what life was like in the First World War, the waiting, the preparation, the battle itself, and the consequences of battle. Some of the accounts are raw and horrific, others more matter of fact or reflective. Some comments. Rain, mud, rats as big as cats, lice, a real menace, the stench of horse carcasses. A soldier who dies in a pit of excrement, as his two mates who have taken him to it are themselves too weak to pull him out when he falls in. Soldiers on leave, in civilian clothes, being taunted by women with the white feather of cowardice. The dead and wounded in no man's land, advancing soldiers unable to stop and help the wounded, or comfort the dying, last rites, the death of close companions, the overwhelming sadness. The undergraduate convinced in August 1914 that the war would be over in time for him to start the new university term on October 7th. The familiar battlefields, among them Ypres, the Somme and Passchendaele, are here illuminated by those who saw them, fought in them, and lived for the rest of their lives with their memories. Real men and women recalling without restraint that period of their lives when death was a constant companion, fear ever present, noise and danger the hourly accompaniment, and when the business of the day, the hours between dawn and midday, was the whole compass of life, overshadowed by the vision and imminent reality of death. 1914. In the glorious sunshine of June 1914, there were no thoughts of war, no international crisis, and no hint that the crowned heads of Europe were to tumble one after the other. The assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire by a Serb-sponsored terrorist on June 28th was neither predictable nor inevitable. Yet within weeks, millions of men were on the march. On August 4th, with Austria and Germany already at war with Russia and France, and with German troops marching into Belgium on their way to Paris, Britain declared war on Germany. Thus, it was that the main body of the British Army was shipped to France. Unlike their allies and enemies, recruited by mass conscription, the British had a small professional army of volunteers. Even with the recently created 1908 Territorial Force and all the reserves mobilised, the British had fewer than 750,000 men in uniform, whom 247,000 were regulars. France, prepared since 1871 for another war with Germany, had 823,000 men in service in 1914. By the end of August, they were reinforced by some 2,870 reservists reporting for duty. A lot of people thought it would be all over by Christmas. How wrong they were. Infantry divisions. For all the excellence of their pre-war training and vastly higher standards, the 6 British infantry divisions could make little strategic difference to the 1914 campaign in Western Europe. France had 62 divisions, Germany fielded 87, Russia had 114. The French launched an all-out offensive to recapture the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, annexed by Germany after the War of 1870. Unwittingly, the French were playing into the hands of their opponents. The German strategy, honed over years by the General Staff, was to gamble everything on a knockout blow in the West. The French assaults collapsed in ruin, while a colossal outflanking movement took place. The German 1st and 2nd armies swept in a wide arc through Belgium and into France, intent on swinging around to seize Paris and strike the main French armies from the flank and rear. The first major action involving the British Expeditionary Force took place on August 23rd, amid the slag heaps and pit heads of the coalfields at Mons. The outnumbered British regulars gave the German conscripts a bloody nose before withdrawing. There was hard marching ahead, although the epic rearguard action by Toucou at Le Cateau on August 26 gained valuable time. The Germans lose control. During the last week of August, the French succeeded in withdrawing in good order to the River Marne. Their commander, General Joffre, jettisoned pre-war strategy and reorganised his forces for a counter-strike on the approaches to Paris. On September 5th to 7th, French attacks from the direction of Paris dislocated the main German thrust, which had outrun its supply depots with grave consequences for its artillery and transport units, all horse-drawn. Joffre raced between his subordinate headquarters in a sports car, coordinated the actions of the French armies. By the end of the war, he had sacked 2 out of 5 army commanders, 9 corps commanders and half his 72 divisional commanders. By contrast, General von Moltke, the German commander-in-chief, lost control of his army commanders and ultimately of himself. He attempted to command by radio from his remote headquarters, once the armies had outrun their telephone lines, but the temperamental machinery broke down and the French listening post atop the Eiffel Tower monitored the transmissions. Eventually, Moltke sent one of his staff officers to drive between the German army commanders and order them to fall back to defensive positions if he deemed it necessary. The Western Front. Germany's grand strategy had failed. The confusingly fluid front line of August and September congealed all the way to the North Sea, leaving the rival armies confronting each other along 400 miles of hastily dug trenches. The new German commander-in-chief, General von Falkenhayn, ordered a last attempt to break through to Dunkirk and Calais at the end of October, but the attack was stopped by the British and French at the Belgian town of Ypres. This halted the German advance, but left the British in an exposed salient. Indeed, all along the front, the Germans were able to pull back to defensive positions and entrench themselves on the high ground. Although 2 German corps were diverted from France to the Eastern Front for the struggle against Russia, it was clear that the main theatre of war would remain the Western Front. While Germany was obliged to stiffen its Austro-Hungarian allies with increasing numbers of divisions, the main body of the German army remained in France and Belgium, facing the British and French. Voices. Private William Dove, 16th Lancers. War had been declared, and the following Sunday I went with a friend of mine to Shepherd's Bush Empire to see the film show. At the end, they showed the fleet sailing the high seas and played Britain's Never Shall Be Slaves and Hearts of Oak. And you know, one feels that little shiver run up the back, and you know you have got to do something. I had just turned 17 at that time, and on the Monday I went up to Whitehall, Old Scotland Yard, and enlisted in the 16th Lancers. Private Thomas Mackindore, 12th Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment. It was seeing the picture of Kitchener and his finger pointing at you. Any position that you took up, the finger was always pointing to you. It was a wonderful poster, really. I was always a tall and fairly fit lad. When I confronted the recruiting officer, he said that I was too young. Although I had said that I was 18 years of age, he said, "Well, I think you're too young, son. Come back in another year or so." I returned home and never said anything to my parents. I picked up my bowler hat, donned it thinking it would make me look older. I presented myself to the recruiting officer again. This time there was no queries. I was accepted. Birth certificates were not asked for, although I had one. Not with me. My mother was very hurt when I arrived home that night and told her that I had to report to Mill Hill next morning. I was 16 in the June. An iconic poster. The first photograph shows young recruits taking the oath, while the second one shows the appeal from the British Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener. It certainly seemed to work as thousands of young people heeded the call. To Berlin, to Berlin. Robert Paustus, French student. When I was a boy in school and within my family, we often spoke about the lost provinces, Alsace-Lorraine, which had been stolen from France after the War of 1870. In the schools, the lost provinces were marked in a special colour on all the maps, as if we were in mourning for them. In the first days of mobilisation, there was of course a lot of enthusiasm. Everybody was shouting and wanted to go to the front. The railway wagons loaded with soldiers were full of tricolour flags and inscriptions. "A Berlin, a Berlin." We wanted to go to Berlin immediately, with bayonets, swords and lances, running after the Germans. The war, we thought, was to last 2 months, maybe 3 months. William Ewan, English student in Germany, once sensed a tremendous expectancy of war in the near future. A favourite bestseller in all the bookshops was World Dominion or Decline. I bought the copy and read it myself. Oh, they had plans for the conquest of the whole of Europe laid out bare. One could feel tremendous resentment in the British attitude towards Germany. We were the band of fellows. We had brought about this Eichresil, this encirclement of poor, unfortunate Germany that seemed to worry them all so much. We had a music hall song. "'Tis the Navy, the Fighting Navy," We will keep them in their place, for they know they will have to face the gallant little lads in navy blue. Oh, how they resented that one. White feathers handed out mistakenly. Captain Philip Neame, Victoria Cross, 15th Field Company, Royal Engineers, pictured. I was stationed at Gibraltar when war was declared, and we officers there were afraid the war would be over quickly, and that we should miss it because we were not part of the British Expeditionary Force. Rifleman Norman de Muth, London Rifle Brigade. As well as being given white feathers, there was another method of approach. You would see a girl come towards you with a delightful smile, and you would think to yourself, my word, this is somebody who knows me. When she got about 5 paces from you, she would suddenly freeze and walk past you with a look of utter contempt and scorn, as if she could have spat on you. That was far more hurtful than a white feather. It made you curl up completely, and there was no replying because she had walked on. However, I was given a white feather when I was 16. I was looking in the shop window and suddenly felt somebody press something into my hand. It was a woman giving me a white feather. I had already been turned down because of my age. So I went round to the recruiting offices with renewed zeal. How to fix bayonets. Corporal Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment, pictured. I was working as a clerk in the Secretary's office at the Post Office in St Martin-le-Grand. It had already enlisted in 1913 in the Territorial Army. We were mobilised on August 4th at camp at Shortcliffe. Private F.B. Ball, 12th Battalion, Yorks and Lancs. So far we'd been individualists. So far we'd been mummy's pet or something like that. We all had a will of our own, and it came rather hard to start to obey commands. But gradually we knew how to form fours, right wheel, left wheel, and all the rest of them. We became, in other words, a disciplined body of men, and then the training consisted largely of route marches, and the country itself, of course, was well known to us. Derbyshire hills and dales, we marched about all over the place. Fixing bayonets is one of the most wonderful things in the army. The Sergeant Major was telling the troops how to fix arms, how to fix bayonets, saying, when I says fix, you don't fix. But when I says bayonets, you whip them out and whop them on. That was the style of our Sergeant Majors, who had been all sweats in the Boer War. They were fine chaps and very good soldiers. When people saw the young lads training, they helped. Rifleman Henry Williamson, London Rifle Brigade. During our training in Crowborough in Sussex, it was a month of great heat. We sweated tremendously. We carried about 60 pounds of ammunition, kit and our rifle. We got blisters. We did about 15 or 16 miles a day, with 10 minutes halt every hour. We lay on our backs gasping. Water bottles were drunk dry. People in cottages, women in sunbonnets, came up with the apples and jugs of water, and we passed some of the battalions who had been in front of us, whose headquarters were in some of the poorer quarters of London. And I remember so well the dead white faces, many with boils, lying completely exhausted, some stricken in the hedges, hundreds of them. The photograph shows a sergeant measuring up his recruits for their uniform. How kind they were, the the Sergeant Majors. 2 school children. Henrik Berthaud, German schoolboy. My memories are those of a child, of course. I was in a small German garrison town in 1914, and I remember very well the tremendous enthusiasm. Of course, we schoolboys were all indoctrinated with great patriotism. When war broke out, my father was an active infantry officer, and I shall never forget the day when they marched out to the trains. All the soldiers were decorated with flowers. There was no gun which did not show a flower. Even the horses, I think, were decorated. And of course, all the people following them. Bands playing, flags flying. A terrific sort of overwhelming conviction that Germany would go into war and win it very quickly. Marjorie Llewellyn, schoolgirl in Sheffield. As a young schoolgirl, I remember there was great excitement in Sheffield when the posters went up showing Kitchener saying, "We want you." And a number of our young men joined up. They were highly educated, most of them. What was called the officer class. They went to the town hall, signed on, and then to their great disappointment were sent home again. They had expected to be in uniform straight away and rush off to win the war, which of course everyone thought would be over by Christmas. By then they were sent to Bramall Lane football ground, where they were drilled and learned to dig trenches. Soon they were put into a camp just out of town, and their training began in earnest. This went on for some time. Eventually their training was completed, and we saw them marching through the streets, going to war. Brussels Falls, August 20th, 1914. German Germaine Soltau, Belgian schoolgirl. I was in Brussels, not expecting the Germans to invade Belgium as we were neutral, so the invasion came as a great shock to us all. We had heard what was happening at the frontier, the killing, the shooting, the atrocities. It was awful. But the fortresses of Liège were holding, and that gave us hope. Brussels then was very silent, and the Grand Place had never been so beautiful, with all the big flags flying on the old historical buildings. Then on August 18th, the government in Brussels left the capital to go to Antwerp. Soon Liège fell, and the Germans were on their way to Brussels. They were preceded by streams of refugees, telling us of the atrocities in the villages and small towns of the Ardennes. We heard about friends from a little village. A young woman shot dead in front of her child after her husband had been taken away to be shot. That happened hundreds and thousands of times. The same story. Then on Thursday, August 20th, the Germans entered Brussels, a glorious day of sunshine. But in my mind, I still keep a vision of those grey-clad hordes marching in the streets. They had with them heavy guns, field kitchens, and officers on horseback. Long, endless streams of grey. The dust was hiding the sun. Their music, the music that we were going to hear for 4 years and 3 months. The sound of the drums, and always the same tune. It made us cry when we heard that, and thought about our soldiers and the Allies on the front line. And then in the evening, on our beautiful Grand Place, they put up their field kitchen and started making their soup. Battle of Mons, August 23rd, 1914. Colonel Walter Birchmore, the Royal Horse Artillery. We had reached a village about 3 miles from Mons in our advance towards the German armies, and we were enjoying the hospitality of the villages. When quite out of the blue came the order, prepare for action, get mounted. We obeyed it immediately, rode out of the village about a couple of miles. We came into action on the high ground overlooking Mons. We immediately engaged the German artillery in and around Banch, where we were firing in support of our infantry and cavalry. It was obvious that the Germans didn't intend to give us any rest. The infantry during the afternoon were driven out of Banch by sheer weight of numbers, then developed a number of charges and countercharges. We gave them all the support we could with our guns. We dealt very severely with a squadron of German cavalry who appeared on our right. We suddenly saw these people coming, didn't realise who they were at first, and we said, by crikey, it's the bloody Germans. So we started gunfire immediately. We fired on open sights and they got about 200 yards from the guns and then wheeled to the left and rode right into a squadron of our own cavalry who dealt with them and finished where we'd left off. The Mons retreat. Fusilier William Holbrook, 4th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. I could see the Germans coming down in waves. They were not in formation, but had more men than us. I was with the officers. When I returned after the first message, I had a job to find my way back, and shortly afterwards, about 3 in the afternoon, I had to take another message. When I got back to where we were before, they had gone. The Germans were just over the bridge. As I went towards Mons, I saw a man with a pack mule. He was suddenly shot clean through the head. I thought, God, what's happening? And then I saw some of their artillery on the road where I had been. Of course, I picked up some other fellows and somehow we got back, but I didn't find my regiment. The fire from the river bank was more like machine gun fire. It was much faster than the German fire, who was suffering a lot of casualties as far as I could see. We were stragglers in between the German and British lines, and other men joined us. When we got outside of Mons, an officer said, "Get everyone together. We'll have to stick together and defend ourselves." The thing that upset me most was the thousands of refugees coming from Mons, mingling with the troops. They were pushing all sorts of things. They seemed to be flabbergasted. They didn't seem to think it was possible that they had been driven back. They did not know what to think. Of course, we could not understand their language. They went across fields, the nearest route to get away, while we kept to the roads. The retreat continues. Gunner J.W. Palmer, the Royal Field Artillery. After advancing several days into Belgium and passing refugees, many of them with little dog carts piled with their pitiful possessions, prams, children, we found ourselves going the same way as the refugees. The road got more congested with refugees, and we got mixed up with the infantry. Many were reservists, who were getting more and more tired, carrying in the region of £100 on their backs, which we didn't have, so their feet got worse and worse. Before the war, we were able to break our boots in, but the reservists didn't get time. They were put straight on a march which lasted for about 150 miles with only very, very few rests. And if they got those boots off, they couldn't get them back on again. Consequently, their feet were bleeding. Of course, all the time, we were retreating. The Germans were having all the food from the houses. We were then told to live off the land. The position over the rations for both men and horses was rather precarious. There were days when we went without rations of any kind or water. The horses were more or less starved of water. On the retreat, we went to various streams with our buckets, but no sooner had we got the water halfway back to them than we moved again. We had strong feelings towards our horses. We went into the fields and beat the corn and oats out of the ears and brought them back, but that didn't save the horses. As the days went on, the horse's belly got more up into the middle of its back, and the cry went down the line, "Saddler, a plate and a punch," which meant the saddler had to come and punch more holes in the leather girth to keep the saddles on. Battle of Lakato, August 25th, 1914. Private Charles Ditcham, 2nd Battalion, Argyll and Southern Highlanders. On the night of the 25th, at 1 in the morning, my battalion went into a factory in the village of Lakato. At 4 o'clock, we moved out hurriedly because the German Uhlans were at the other end of the village, so we took our position to do a rearguard action for the expeditionary force. All this meant was that the company was put in a cornfield and we were told to dig ourselves in. Then the party started when the Hun came along. It made me realise what war was about. We lined up in a cornfield, one company on the right, another on the left, Middlesex and other people, all mixed up. The Germans came in their hordes and were just shut down, but they still kept coming and shoved us out of the field, and then the realisation what war meant. When I saw Company Sergeant Major Sin wounded in the mouth, he was dripping blood. Many people were getting killed and wounded. We took part in an orderly retreat. When we arrived at Lakato, it gave me the shock of my life to see all the badly wounded people there. There were stretcher cases and walking cases. The church was full of them, so we left the wounded and just followed the tribe. No idea where it was going. I saw an old soldier who had served with my father driving the ammunition wagon in my company. He was taken back 2 Clydesdale horses. The wagon had been dumped, and he dragged me onto the back of one of the Clydesdales. I sat on it half asleep till we arrived at St. Quentin the following morning. When I fell off the horse, I could hardly walk. Red Handkerchief. Sergeant Thomas Painting, 1st Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps. We were not allowed to have white handkerchiefs in case we used them as a white flag. We had to buy a red handkerchief. I remember the first bit of French I learned was mouchoir rouge, handkerchief red. On the morning of August 21st, we started to march up to Mons, scorching hot. The French roads were cobbles, terrible to march on, and Route Nationale straight as a die. You could see for miles in front of you. The road seemed endless. After Givry, we pushed on a couple of miles northeast in the direction of where the German army was coming and dug some trenches there. Number 70 Battery, RFA, was on a ridge just to our left. A couple of German aeroplanes came over, spotted the guns' flashes and opened fire. Then the Jerry's artillery started searching the ground, which cut one section of my trench to pieces. The gunners had 3 of their own guns knocked out of action, but the gunners were jolly good and crowed from one gun to the other and kept them going. As one gun was knocked out, they got into action again. Jerry played a searchlight on us during the night, and we were going to be for it. But early the next morning, our retirement started and we made our way to Bavay, where the Germans shelled us. We moved off. that one of their cavalry regiments stopped the shells which were meant for us. We were very pleased to see that. On the 25th, we got as far as Morals and anchored down. That was at the same time as the Germans made an attack at Lecato. We had a night operation there alongside the Berkshires, and we had to carry on with the retirement the next morning. £7 tins. Sergeant Thomas Painting, 1st Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps. During the day, we saw our first French troops. I was surprised to see them and what they were wearing. Their cavalry went into action with their cuirasses on and plumed helmets. The infantry wore red trousers, a long blue overcoat, and were wearing their war medals from the African campaign. They were going into action at Guise with no camouflage, but they suffered badly and had to retire. During that day, we joined up with the Guards Brigade again. On the 27th, we got beyond the fortress of La Fère, where we had a break. General French saw us there. He seemed in good spirits, which bucked us up a bit. Then we marched on to Armagny. We had a kind of day's break there. I suppose the action at Lecato and at Landrecies and Morals caused Jerry to pull himself up a little bit, because he didn't press us. On we went in this really sweltering weather. On the night of the 31st, we reached Courcy-le-Château, and the next morning we marched through Soissons, where we had a few hours' halt on the River Aisne. We then had to hold a bridge at Saint-Bandry until it was blown up by our engineers. Then we were off again at dawn. It was always dawn. We slept in the fields, just anchored down for an hour or so, and then moved again. Our food was dished up from ration carts, which we ate on the march. Bully beef was issued in £7 tins. Well, you couldn't expect someone to carry that weight, so we used to open our tins and share it out. That was our ration. Bully beef, biscuits and water. No time for anything else. £7 tins. First Battle of the Marne, September 5th to 10th. Sergeant Thomas Painting, 1st Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps. We fought a rearguard action at Saint-Bandry, then marched to Boutezenay, where we halted. The colonel came along and said, "Who's in charge here?" I said, "I am, sir." He replied, "Right, down the road a little way, turn left and join the next attack with C Company. Range 1500 yards. We formed up on the right of C Company, then attacked the German Jäger Battalion, a horse and rifle battalion such as we were. We had only 2 machine guns in the battalion. As soon as we started, our machine gun sergeant was killed. We went forward. One section would advance under covering fire of another section, leapfrogging each other as the others kept firing to keep Jerry's head down. My company was going in with their bayonets when suddenly Jerry put up a white flag. We took 450 prisoners. I said to one of them, "Why did you pack up when you've got so much ammunition?" He replied, "Well, your fire was so accurate we couldn't put our heads up to shoot at you. We lost 12 men killed and 60 wounded. They had lost about 180 men. We had to guard them all night. They slept nicely on straw, while we had to guard them and give them half-hour rations." First Battle of the Marne continued. Sergeant Thomas Painting, 1st Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps. The next day it rained in bucketfuls. We lit the fire and stood while we dried our clothes. We felt an enormous sense of pride. field day, fire and movement. One section firing while the other moved, into communication with each other. An absolutely set-piece operation. And what was more satisfying to us was that it was a crack battalion, a Jaeger battalion, and we had held them. The Germans were not going to get their way. The Middlesex Regiment's transport comes under fire in the photograph. The man in the centre has been badly wounded in the face. Big decisions to be made. Lieutenant Edward Louis Spears, liaison officer with the headquarters of the French 5th Army on Western Front. I was introduced to General Joffre. I had never seen a picture of the man and was astonished to find a big, heavy, bulky individual walking up and down the square with his hands behind his back. He had very light eyes. He was an albino, in fact, with pepper and salt hair, a pepper and salt walrus moustache, and was wearing a black tunic, which fitted extremely badly, sloping outwards from the 3rd or 4th button down. Also ill-fitting red breeches and abominable gaiters, which as a cavalry officer I was very critical of. I watched him very carefully because he was an important man, perhaps the most important man on the whole of the Allied side at that time, who was commanding enormous forces, counted in hundreds of thousands of men, perhaps as many as 1 million or more. The fate of his country was in the balance. He had to satisfy the political requirements of the British government and face a catastrophic situation, while never getting rattled, always in bed by 10 o'clock, always ate enormous quantities of food, took a little walk with an ADC after meals. I actually saw him on the afternoon that he decided the Battle of the Marne. It was an extraordinary thing. Very few people can have seen anybody with such a burden placed on his shoulders, with nobody to help, just weighing the pros and cons of this movement. And that movement, what orders to issue. It lasted quite a long time, a couple of hours. Then he got up, his decision was made, and the orders went out that night. Battle of the Aisne, September 14th to 28th. Sergeant Thomas Painting, 1st Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps. At the Battle of the Aisne, we got over the river and onto high ground, over a mile in front of the Aisne. We knew there was a brigade of Jerrys against us, and we were only 7 platoons. During the fight, we got pushed back about 300 yards. We had to leave our wounded and dead. The Highland Light Infantry and Worcesters came up. Private Wilson of the HLI and one of our men attacked a machine gun. Our man got killed. But Private Wilson killed the machine gunner and captured the position and got the Victoria Cross. Our man got a wooden cross. That's the difference, you see. One killed, one a Victoria Cross. Private Aston Clee Gobert, Uhlans Regiment, German Army. During the first days of the war, I joined a Lancers Regiment, and because I could ride and shoot, I was at the front within 6 or 7 weeks. This experience for a young boy of 20, who 8 or 9 weeks ago was at home, was very new and adventurous. Further, there were only 2 or 3 volunteers in this squadron of experienced soldiers. They were between 22 and 27 years old, and they all had a profession. While we were students, so life was very new for us. They were accustomed to everything. While we had never lived with a horse, the horse was the main thing for the next 40 or 50 months. I never had a bed until I think November 1915, because we had always to sleep with the horses in stables or elsewhere. Reinforcements. Rifleman Henry Williamson, London Rifle Brigade. Then the orders came through. I remember in the tented lines on Crowborough Heath. They came down early in the morning with the colour sergeant of the company. The fellows rolled over and kicked their legs in the air and cheered and cheered and cheered some more. Tremendously excited. I was not excited, I was apprehensive. I did not believe the war was going to be over by Christmas. I had a feeling from having talked to chaps from Mons in the local hospital that it wasn't altogether going to be a picnic. Trooper George Jameson, 1st Battalion Northumberland Hussars. We gradually drifted sideways from Zeebrugge and arrived on the mole at dusk. By the time we'd got our horses and everything off, the town was in darkness. There wasn't a light anywhere. There wasn't a person in the streets. But as we were riding through the town, the clatter of hooves brought all the lights on and the doors open. All the men and wives and girls came rushing out and embraced us. Bottles of wine, loaves of bread, and all sorts were thrust upon us. You talked about a triumphal entry, it wasn't in it. Fall of Antwerp, October 1914. Sergeant Richard Toby, Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. On a brisk October morning, we arrived in the threatened port of Antwerp. People lined the street, they cheered, they waved, there were flowers and wine. The war was young and so were we. We felt gallant, they felt relieved. Out to the trenches we went. We settled, opened reserve ammunition, fixed our bayonets and said, now let them come. Night came, but not the enemy. We posted sentries and settled down, but not for long. Heavy rifle fire broke out all around us. We manned the firing step and peered over. Searchlights from the fort swept the front. We could see nothing. We held our fire and felt neglected. Morning came, but still no enemy. Suddenly, high in the sky, was a train-like rumble and whistle, followed by an explosion. Smoke and flame shot up in the city. An old hand said, "They're howitzer shells. The bastards must be a dozen miles away." We felt useless. On October 8th, an order came, prepare to move. On reaching the road, we received the most deadening, soul-racking order, retreat. We picked our way through burning buildings, past flaming oil tanks, to the flaming pontoon bridge the engineers had built for us to cross and then destroy. On each side of the bridge stood hordes of refugees, children, women, nuns, priests. The flare from the burning lit their faces, expressionless and hopeless. We felt ashamed. An officer called to me, "Sergeant, shout break step." It should have been break hearts. We were soon across and in open country. After a few miles, we arrived at a Belgian village, and the orders were, "Rest where you stand. Be ready for any alarm." The fall of Antwerp continued. Sergeant Richard Toby, the Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. Sad is not a soldier's word. Brand off, fed up, yes. But the only time a soldier is really and deeply sad is when his line of duty takes him among refugees, those weary, shuffling, hopeless columns, chiefly women, children and the aged, carrying or pulling a pram, wheelbarrow, farm cart, piled high with their world and often perched on top, a grandmother. If his unit is rushing forward, pressing those weary souls aside so that the troops could get ahead and engage the enemy. Just by was the church. Straw had been placed all around it, and there were dark forms lying on it. My pal and I moved to the straw and were about to settle down when we noticed two young women. With a mumbled apology, we were moving away when a voice said in good English, "Don't go, please." We squatted down and I saw one of the women was nursing a whimpering baby. "Is your baby all right?" With a sad smile she said, "It's not my baby. I don't even know the mother. We are tired and hungry." My pal and I emptied from our haversacks 2 tins of sardines and army biscuits. The young woman said, "The baby needs milk." I swung my water bottle round. I think the baby was surprised because it contained milk. Quite soon we fell in and marched away. The British government had lost a water bottle, but a baby found a meal. First Battle of Ypres, October to November 1914. Captain Reginald Thomas, Royal Artillery, we were terribly short of hand grenades. In fact, I don't think they were even invented at that time. The British Army began using them in 1913, but we really needed something to hurl at the enemy. And so with Philip Neam's aid, he was a sapper and I was a gunner. We concocted some jam tin bombs and hurled them into the German trenches. They were very successful. The War Office of the government eventually supplied us with bombs that were exactly the same shape as the jam tin. They were handy to hold and you could throw them 20 or 30 yards. We did very, very well with our tins. Captain Philip Neame, a 15th Field Company, Royal Engineers. It was important that we developed hand grenades because the Germans were well supplied with well-made ones and we had no proper reply. Although there was an official British hand grenade, it had hardly been used at all in peacetime training and there was a very limited supply of it. Therefore, the Royal Engineers in France started devising homemade hand grenades called bombs. They were made out of empty jam tins, which were filled with rivets, hobnails and any small bits of metal. Trenches are all designed with traverses between each fire bay. You can't shoot the enemy in the next fire bay, so the only way of getting at him is by lobbing a hand grenade over the traverse. It goes off with a terrific explosion and will probably kill or wound all the soldiers in that length of trench. They were very, very useful. Death was everywhere. Sergeant Stephen Westman, 29th Division, German Army. All of a sudden, the enemy fire ceased. Complete silence came over the battlefield. Then one of the chaps in my shell hole said, "I wonder what they're up to." And another answered, "Perhaps they're getting tea." We looked over the brim of our shell hole, and there between the brick heaps, out had come a British soldier with a Red Cross flag that he waved at us, and he was followed by stretcher bearers who came slowly towards us and collected our wounded. We got up, still completely done from fear of death, and helped them to bring our wounded into our trenches. Nurse Eleonora Pemberton. I had interesting experience in Boulogne. When I stood with the others on the quay at Boulogne and watched Lord Robert's little coffin broke down to be put on a ship to go back to England. He had died at the age of 82 while visiting the Indian troops at the front. It was a wonderful sight and a most moving one. A little coffin, a very small one, because he was very short. It was carried by 4 Tommies, straight from the battlefield, covered in mud, muddy boots, hair anyhow. They were carrying their caps, and they carried this little coffin down the quayside onto the boat, and the band played the last post, and then the Dead March in Soul. It was a most moving occasion. I shall never forget it. I can see it even now. The London Omnibus. Private Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment. We moved to the front in 30 or 40 London omnibuses. When we boarded these, everybody wanted to get on the top deck because it was quite a nice day, fairly bright for November. But we had not been going very long before it started to rain, so we got thoroughly soaked. We must have travelled for quite a few hours, for it was dark when we eventually reached our destination, Blamerton. We were lined up and given a very generous issue of rum. I didn't even drink beer, so in no time we were quite euphoric, really. We were quite happy, but we did not know where we were going. But the moon broke through the clouds and it was a lovely night, and I can remember as we marched along, we passed a Roman Catholic priest who removed his hat and murmured his blessings. We spent a cold night in a field. In the morning we were told to go up a wooded hillside where we found dugouts. We could rest there much more comfortably, as in a dugout you could lay down. When it was light, we simply came out to survey our surroundings. We could see a road running towards Ypres from our hillside, and on it we saw a group of French soldiers. While we were watching, there was a sound of heavy gunfire, and after a few seconds, 3 violent explosions. When the smoke cleared, we saw this group picking up one of their number and immediately started to do the grave thing, killed by the shell. That was the first time we realised what the war was all about, what the Germans could do. December. Private Reginald Hayne, 1st Battalion, Honourable Artillery Company. As far as sandbags are concerned, the first time I saw a sandbag in France was when we were paraded one evening at Kemmel, a small town half a mile behind the lines. Kemmel had been knocked about. There were lots of broken bricks and that sort of thing. The pioneers had filled the sandbags and we carried them up one by one to the line. Of course, going up on a trip like that one was bound to have casualties. Sometimes it was a quiet night and you suffered 1 or 2 fellows wounded, but sometimes you were not so lucky if you faced a machine gun. The photograph shows a soldier peering through a boxed periscope at enemy trenches. The shelling was not the big stuff we faced later on in the war. They were equivalent to our 18-pounders. They were little chaps. The finest training for warfare is warfare itself. In a fortnight you'll learn more than 2 years of training can teach you. So before the end of the year, we were a very seasoned battalion, and I say it without bragging. We were as good as any regular battalion in the line. There was nobody behind except people like the Army Service Corps and suppliers. December continued. Private Reginald Hayne, the 1st Battalion, the Honourable Artillery Company. Practically the whole time you had to sleep with your boots on, as well as all your clothes on. The winter of 1914 was extremely hard, because we had no amenities. It was just ditches. Trenches were waterlogged ditches, and you were often up to your knees in frozen mud. You could do nothing about it. The actual fighting was nothing like it was in the later years of the war, the years I know most from a fighting point of view. And of course, the casualties were horrific. But in 1914, there were many casualties through sickness and shelling. We had not been trained for any of the tasks we were asked to undertake. We had to improvise really. The ordinary infantryman shot his rifle, and we had a couple of Vickers guns in the battalion. That's all the machine guns the battalion had in those days. And there were specially trained people who used to have to hunt their ammunition for them, which was a hell of a job. That was because sometimes you would march 2 or 3 miles to get near the firing line. Then we would have to carry not only our own kit with 250 rounds of ammunition, but sometimes they'd ask us to, between 2 people, carry up to 1,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition as well. And in those conditions, in the winter of 1914, when everything was as muddy as it could be, there was really no drainage or anything. It was a terrific task. From a physical point of view, it was a killing job, but most of us got through it. Captain Neame takes charge. Captain Philip Neame, the 15th Field Company Royal Engineers. The 8th Division carried out an attack on December 18, 1914, near Neuf-Chapelle. And during the early hours of the 19th, in fact, in the middle of the night, I was ordered up to the area of attack with my Royal Engineers section to help consolidate the captured area. When I got to the front, I was told that the Germans were counter-attacking, and the CO of the infantry battalion concerned asked me to go into the line and see what I could do in making our defences strong. I took my sapper section forward, got up to the front and heard noise of fighting and bombs exploding. They were called bombs then, they were actually hand grenades. I left my section of sappers, about 36 men, under a sergeant in our old front line, while I crawled forward up a ditch and got into the German trenches where our leading infantry were, just to see what was happening. When I got there, I saw the infantry officer in command who said the Germans were counter-attacking with bombs and that his own bombers had all been wounded. So I went to talk to one of the remaining bombers and discovered that he couldn't light our bombs because there were no fuses left. So I got to the front and started throwing bombs back at the Germans. I was the only one who knew how to light our bombs, so I shouted for all our variable bombs to be sent to me. I then started lighting and throwing the bombs in the 2 different directions from which the Germans were throwing bombs at us. On the horizon, Victoria Cross. Captain Philip Neame, 15th Field Company Royal Engineers. Every time I stood up to throw a bomb, a German machine gun fired at me. I heard shouts and screams from the Jerrys, so my bombs had the desired effect. The German bombing eased off, and after about 15 minutes, it almost stopped altogether. I stayed there with the West Yorkshire infantrymen until the officer in command, Captain Ingpen, came along to see how things were going and told me to evacuate the German trench. We all got back safely. Mind you, a great many had been killed and wounded. I helped the wounded, and in the end I joined up with my sappers and my sergeant, who helped me to carry a badly wounded infantryman along the road in full view of the Germans. They seemed to respect our task, as they did not shoot at us. We were sitting ducks. I then reported at the battalion, where the 2 infantry colonels of the West Yorks and the Devons asked me to take my section of sappers back to the front line again. So we patched up breastworks and French defences for the rest of the day. Then when I returned to my field company headquarters and told my officer in commanding what had happened during the day, he said, "If you're not careful, Neil, you'll be getting the Victoria Cross." 6 days after the event, our divisional commander, Major General Davis, said to me, "A happy Christmas to you, Neil. I've recommended you for the Victoria Cross." That was the first time I really took it seriously. I just said, "Well, thank you very much, sir." And his ADC came to me afterwards and said, "Well, that's a nice Christmas present, Neil, isn't it?" Christmas 1914. Private Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment. We'd all got these long, thick woolen underpants and vests on, and we were soaked right through. When we got back to the trench, it was dark. We tried to get round this little brazier fire, and then they brought us Princess Mary's gift box. In this box was cigarettes, tobacco, and a bar of chocolate, which was very much appreciated. And then we had what the English newspapers called Christmas dinner. This consisted of cold bully beef and a cold lump of Christmas pudding. That was our Christmas dinner. The newspapers said the British troops in the front line enjoyed their Christmas dinner. Sergeant George Ashurst, 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. There was 200 yards between us and the Germans until some Jerrys came to their wire waving a newspaper. Anyway, the corporal went for it. He went right to the wire, and the Germans shook hands with him and wished him a Merry Christmas. There were still fellows walking about on top of the trench at 5 o'clock at tea time. Not a shot had been fired, although the armistice had officially finished at 1 o'clock. Eventually we got orders. "Get back in your trenches, every man." The order was passed by word of mouth down the trench. Anyway, the generals behind us must have got a bit suspicious and ordered a battery of guns to open fire at the Jerrys. That started the war again. We were cursing the generals to hell. Never mind giving orders in your big chateau or driving about in your big cars. We hated the sight of bloody generals. Then we had newspapers from England accusing us of fraternising with the Germans. I wrote back home and said, "Send the journalists here in front of us so we could shoot them for passing remarks like that while nice and safe in England." Christmas 1914. Lieutenant John Wedderburn Maxwell, Royal Field Artillery. There was a party, a couple of 100 yards away, of our troops and the Germans all fraternising. I said I was going to have a look and told the infantry to keep an eye on me in case anybody tried any rough business. I met a small party who said, "Come into our trenches and have a look at us." But I was near enough and turned down the invitation. We laughed at each other and I gave them some English tobacco and they gave me some German. Then we walked about in no man's land for half an hour. Then we shook hands, wished each other luck, and one fellow said, "Will you send this letter to my girlfriend in Manchester?" So I took the letter, franked it and posted it. At midnight we were ordered into action. Rifleman Henry Williams, the London Rifle Brigade. That evening the Germans sent over a note saying that their staff was visiting their trenches that night, so the truce must end and they would start firing their machine guns. They would fire them high, but could we keep under cover in case regrettable accidents occurred? At 11 o'clock precisely they opened up. We saw flashes of the machine guns going high, and it was passed back to the intelligence that the Germans were using Berlin time, which is 1 hour ahead of them, 1 hour before British time. I suppose that was important for our intelligence, and that was the end of our truce. We did not fire, and they did not fire for a day or two. But then the Prussians came in and relieved the Saxons, and then we began to lose more men from sniping, and we went out after that. Christmas 1914. Private Henry Williamson, London Rifle Brigade. On December 19th, 1914, the brigade was ordered to make an attack on a German trench. The attack was to be made in daylight. We were to support the attack. We were ordered to lie down at the edge of the wood and wait events. There was practically no bombardment because there were very few shells. I think the ration was 2 a day for our heavy guns, our 6-inch long toms they were called, but the shells screamed over us, 2 bursting in our front trench, 4 burst in no man's land. Then we heard the hoarse cries and shouts of the East Lancs, who were making an attack. They were only about 6 yards forward, then the machine guns opened up and down they went. Cries and screams. We were in support and laid there for about 4 hours. Then the order came. The London Rifle Brigade will carry on the attack. I noticed my friend Baldwin had a white face. I felt drained. My knees were wobbling. We lay there for another 30 minutes. Then we heard with great relief that the attack was not to be repeated. So we went out and helped the stretcher bearers. I remember one man being carried back, and he sang in a tenor voice, "Oh, for the wings of a dove, far, far away would I roam." And away in the woods, as we went back to have our rum ration, we heard him singing as the stars came out. But one poor chap, he took his first sip of rum and gave a shriek. Dropped the jar because some fellow had stolen the rum and filled the jar with brown Condy's fluid, a powerful disinfectant. This poor fellow had taken a mouthful. It went down into his stomach. We heard he died later. Christmas 1940. Private Frank Sumter, London Rifle Brigade. After the attack on December 19th, we were back in the same trenches when Christmas Day came along. It was a terrible winter. Everything was covered in snow. Everything was white. The devastated landscape looked terrible in its true colours. Clay and mud and broken brick. But when it was covered in snow, it was beautiful. Then we heard the Germans singing, "Silent Night, Holy Night." And they put up a notice saying, "Merry Christmas." So we put one up too. While they were singing, our boys said, "Let's join in." So we joined in, and when we started singing, they stopped. Then one German took a chance and jumped on top of the trench and shouted, "Happy Christmas, Tommy." So of course, our boys said, "If he can do it, we can do it." And we all jumped up. The sergeant major shouted, "Get down," but we said, "Shut up, sergeant. It's Christmas time." And we all went forward to the barbed wire. We just shook hands, and I spoke to one German who said, "Do you know where the Essex Road is in London?" I replied, "Yes, my uncle's had a shoe repair shop there." He replied, "That's funny. There's a barber shop on the other side where I used to work." They could all speak very good English because before the war, Britain was invaded by Germans. Every pork butcher was German. Every barber shop was German. They were in Britain getting the lowdown on the country. It's ironic when you think about it. He must have shaved my uncle at times, and yet my bullet might have found him, and his bullet might have found me. The officers gave the order, "No fraternisation." Then they turned their backs on us. In Flanders fields the poppies blow. Horses were heavily relied upon in the Great War, primarily for transport. They were first involved in a British cavalry attack near Mons in August 1914. Both Britain and Germany had a cavalry force that numbered about 100,000 men when war broke out in August 1914. Each cavalry force required a large number of horses, with most senior military personnel during that era believing in the supremacy of the cavalry attack. In August 1914, when the war took a turn for the worse, no one could have foretold the horrors of trench warfare. Hence, cavalry regiments were considered superior. As a matter of fact, the cavalry regiments would have been seen as the greatest regiment in the British Army and superior to the Guard regiments. Many senior army positions were also held by cavalry officers. The cavalry charge that occurred in Mons was the last seen in the war. Such charges were rendered impractical and simply not possible due to trench warfare. But some cavalry changes were made possible. However, in March 1918, the Germans were attacked by a British cavalry charge. By the spring of 1918, out of the 150 war horses that were used, only 4 made it back. German machine gun fire was the main reason that most of the horses did not survive. It was carnage. Despite the fact that cavalry charges were no longer a viable military tactic, horses were still crucial as a form of transport. Transporting materials to the battlefronts, horses remained reliable as military vehicles because mechanised vehicles such as lorries and tanks were prone to breakdowns, as they were still relatively new inventions. Furthermore, horses and mules required little upkeep compared to lorries and trucks. On the Western Front, more than 8 million horses died in battle. Veterinary hospitals treated over 2.5 million horses, with about 2 million being sufficiently cured and cleared to return to duty. As horses were in demand during the Great War, Britain responded to this shortage by importing them from America and New Zealand, with as many as 1 million coming from America at a cost of £67.5 million. My uncle fought in the Great War. Private Robert Stackhouse, number 49356, was with the 1st Battalion of the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment, and he received the British War and Allied Victory Medals, which confirmed that he served overseas. His number is a high number in the context of those issued to soldiers of the King's Own, and it was probably one issued in 1918. And I suspect he did not serve long on the Western Front before the war ended. These were details given to me by the curator of the King's Own Museum. The Allied Victory Medal, inscribed with the words "within a laurel wreath," which is a symbol for victory, the Great War for Civilization, 1914 to 19. His service number, rank, name and unit was impressed on the rim of the Victory Medal. The British version depicts the winged figure of victory on the front of the medal. He was gassed in the Great War and was never the same after that atrocity. The family all remember him as a kindly man who never spoke about the war. He was born in 1898, one of 4 sons and a daughter. Mary 1892, John 1892, my grandfather, William 1895, Thomas 1906, to William and Margaret Stackhouse. John McCrae, consulting surgeon to the British Army. In Flanders fails the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that marks our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the cones below. We are the dead, short days ago we lived, our quarrel with the foe. To you from fallen hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field.